Welcome back, everyone.
I hope your dinner is good, Melina. We all deserve to eat.
I'm so sorry. I actually have to go to a funeral event after this, so I'm just trying to. Excuse me.
No
I know off
apologize.
camera, but I'm here.
No apologies
Thank you.
necessary.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we all have to take care of ourselves. So please, there's babies in commutes, there's puppies you might hear, people need to have dinner. So do what you need to do to care for yourselves always. I'd love to hear what was going on in those rooms. So we sent you away for our first connector for folks that are just joining. And we went with two prompts that my colleague Fang is going to put in the chat. The first was, who do you associate as a gender role model in your life? Or who have you associated? Does anyone want to share?
Well, in my group, we all seemed to go for grandma. It was a grandma group. It was interesting. Yeah, we all.
What characteristics? I can imagine some, but I did not have too close of a relationship with my own grandmother. But what are some of the characteristics that a grandma held as a role model that made her a role model to you all in that group? Anyone can say, and Valentina, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, in my case, she was, I think, a great example of someone who was like, well, old-fashioned, Italy, but she was also very strong. She was in the resistance during the war, so she was someone who could be kind of sweet and kind, but also very, very strong and with great beliefs that she fought for, like, in the war. So she was a fighter and a giver at the same time.
So I hear
she represented two. If you think she wasn't, she had male and female in her stereotyped ideas of male and female, I should say.
I love that. So it was I heard character traits. So sometimes when folks share, and you might all share in this way in a second as well as we hear from more people, we stick on appearance, right? Somebody you said looks strong and they happen to identify in a certain way. So I love the fact that this grandmother, and I can almost see a grandma sitting there holding culture, history, and then this strength, right, of being able to move in the world, probably shaping folks in some way. What else about the grandma character and about that image? Does anyone else have anything to add? Why they were a role model?
I can share, my Peruvian grandma was, she was the only grandmother I had, and I had a really, really strong connection with her. And I think one of the things that I learned from her was like being the caretaker, right? She was sweet, caretaker, very fair. She loved all her grandkids the same. We never felt like she preferred any of us. And I really liked that about her. She was a great storyteller. So yeah.
So in that ideal of the role model, the grandma actually does fall into what society has us create as more feminine roles, right? Gender stereotypical roles of a caretaker, maybe a nurturer, somebody who kept balance between the group. But not necessarily according to Valentina's grandma. So I love the dynamic of the multitude of identities within a grandma. Who else had somebody else who did not identify with the grandma as the role model?
So my grandma in Italy, Nonna Elena, she is very kind to me, and she's really sweet, and she always, well, it does seem like there's, like, when I mess up, there's usually like I right my wrong, and then I am good with it, and I don't get more than what I deserve when I mess up, but she also is really, how do I say this? She's really good at making sure that she always is clear that it's not the right thing to do, but if it's a small thing, it's not too big, but if it's not too small, it's a little bigger, and maybe it's a little different.
So fairness, right? I heard the balance of fairness, like Karina's grandma, Marcello, that this is a person who is able to create balance, right, between people in the family. The second question I'd love to hear from folks, and maybe from folks we haven't heard of yet today, was the question around, sorry, my screen. At what age did you become aware of gender identity? When did it occur to you that gender was a thing? Did anybody have a strong memory?
I can speak
Danny?
actually. Yeah. Hi, I'm Danny. It took me a second because I didn't think I would have an idea. And then I remembered very clearly in being in preschool, I was probably 4 years old, where I had a best friend whose name was Brian, and I helped him with everything. I thought he needed my help. I took care of him as my mom took care of me. And we were from the outset always told that we would be married and that we were going to do this, and all of these outside people telling us that we, basically putting us in a, in a box or in a role, without, just by watching us. And so I think, that was a moment where I understood the difference from me and him at that time. Yeah, and it just speaking, very clearly. I remember that.
Do others? Thank you, Danny. And it's such it's a replicable memory. Like I remember, that moment in time where gender became a reality for me, and a limiting one, right? So I wonder if you hadn't taken care of that person, would there have been a repercussion to you or how would that have appeared to you as a child if you maybe chose that you didn't want to take care of this person? That they were okay taking care of themselves, and why would you have to carry that responsibility because of the body you were in, right? So all the ways that those messages create a function for us of how we're supposed to interact with other people, even as early as preschool. So that's like 3 and 4 years old. Do other folks here have that? Even now, as you hear someone's story, is anyone coming up with like, oh, there is a moment in time? And for some of us, it might have been way later, where gender became this identity. Lama.
Actually, the example that comes to mind as you guys were, I haven't really thought about it before, but when I was in elementary school, and I don't remember like what grade, like I think around 3rd grade or something. We were in Syria, and everybody in Syria, all boys in Syria, played soccer in like just outside in the street. And I used to play soccer all the time, and I loved soccer and I wanted to play, but it was only boys that could play. So my brother just decided to give me a boy's name. And then I played, and everybody assumed I was a boy, and I had short hair, and I was too young to actually tell physically whether I was a boy or a girl. So I played for days as a boy.
That's so interesting, Lama. I resonate. I used to play prior to transition, and I shared for folks that came on, I identify as a transmasculine person, meaning I was assigned female at birth, and have chosen that identity didn't fit in the way that I identified with myself, and transitioned not until I was 30 years of age. So had a whole lifetime, personally and professionally, before I made that choice for myself. But one of the things that resonates with your story, Lama, is that as a child, I loved playing soccer. I'm Ecuadorian. It's the thing, the national thing to do. Soccer was this, everybody does it. It's a way to come together. And I was good at it, better than my brother. And I played outside. And it wasn't until that moment where genetically my body started to change and I no longer could be seen as just one of the kids outside, that I became aware of gender. And it became very limiting to me, to the point where it was toxic at a certain point, because culturally, femininity had a specific place and role in society, meaning how people perceived you was very important. So if you were perceived as a tomboy, as not feminine enough, it was something that could be seen as a negative towards your family or the way that you were being educated or brought up. And so it became a very limiting factor for me in my life. And actually, I remember till this day became a breaking point between me and family, because it was, I either performed in a way that didn't feel natural to me in my identity, even at that young of an age, or I chose to be different, and that was also wrong. And so either way, it created a fragmentation of what I think all of you know is a huge time in a child's life between the infancy and kind of your early development stages of like 5 and 7, where your closest attachment figure are your parents or your immediate caretakers, whoever that is, grandma, auntie, but that adult, right, who's supposed to be caring and attentive and is forming the way that you relate to yourself later on in life. For those folks that want more, it's called attachment theory. There's a lot of research on it. But any breaking point of having that adult caretaker be that person that you could trust and feel safe with has a long-term impact for you psychologically in the way that you develop. And so, Lama, I feel for you, and I wonder with that, what was the relationship at that moment where, was there a change for you when your body no longer could pass as gender neutral or not as feminine, where you were no longer allowed to play something that you liked?
Well, I mean, it's because this was like summers in Syria, right? So it wasn't where I lived. But to me, what was actually interesting is that it all ended in a few days because somebody made a mistake and said that I was a girl. So it, like, that was the end of it. But you know, now that you say that, to me, what is interesting, fast forward many years later, I went to Madison for college. And funny enough that I was actually kind of exposed to the same thing that much later in the US, right? And it was at school at UW-Madison. And there was a group of, you know, people who were playing. And they were all like religious Muslims, you know, playing. And we just happened to be me and some friends of mine who were walking by. And it's like, oh yeah, let's play, right? And literally they're all like, well, we can't play with girls. So girls can't play. And it just, to me, it was like, you know, usually, okay, I'm accepting of, you know, different, I mean, I come from the Middle East, I understand these things. But for this one, it triggered me in a way that I don't think I've ever connected that connection back to when I was a child and felt that. Because like as an adult, right, it annoys me, but like my reaction was so over the top that day. I'm like, where did this come from? And I never actually connected it back until we started talking about it now. And this, you know, again, this incident was maybe 20 years, more than 20 years ago. I was in college, so 30 years ago or so. But it's kind of interesting how these things actually do stay with you longer than you think.
Yeah.
You internalize.
Yeah, we internalize the messaging, and I think that, you know, that's why this is such a special space, because even though we're speaking it in such an intimate way of what happened in your life or what happened in mine or what happened with grandmas in the kitchen, you know, these are messages that our young people are getting every day from gender reveal parties, you know, that are happening more and more so, to the way that even, you know, capitalism constructs buildings, how toy stores and retail stores and how things are branded are all gendered. I think some stores, I'll name one, not because I work for Target or I'm getting any subsidies in this workshop from Target. Target is one of the stores that is trying to break away from those norms, but even that change is fairly recent and not consistent from store to store. So what does that mean for a young child who is trying to navigate identity right? To feel like they can walk into a place with their family. And even if they're not speaking all of this internalized stuff, Lama, that you said, like, I didn't realize all those connections. How are they embodying those feelings of not belonging, right? And how do we as adults create a feeling of belonging in places like school, the institution that triggered that memory for you, which is an institution we have to engage with for so many years. And so many of those years before we have agency or voice to where we want to go to school, right? You all have chosen La Scuola for your young people. And if you teach there, or if you're an administrator there, you've chosen to work there. But what's the everyday experience of young people in this school, and how do we create a sense of belonging for difference, whatever that may be, right? As folks navigate what that looks like in not just their younger years, but like I shared, maybe all the way into 30, or Lama, like you shared when you were in college and had this moment. So institutions become a big factor, institutions in all their forms, but education in the way that we're speaking tonight becomes a big pillar for either acceptance or pain to be part of your gender journey. Thank you all for sharing. I'm gonna screen out and let's go back to the slides. So what does this mean? So how can we begin to foster a sense of belonging? Well, the first thing I'll share is that I think the piece that attracted me most about coming to this, and I'm invited to these kind of conversations often, is that there's the intersection of religion and culture and language that needs attention. And so what I loved about Marcello's story about Grandma Nonna, I think that was the name, Grandma Nonna in Italy, is that there's a transgression even in the culture, which you would imagine is much more steeped in maybe religious ideology or just history, right, of how things might once were, that there's this Nonna out there who's trying to make sure Marcello feels seen and cared for, and that's amazing. And so how do we begin to make observations, and what we're showing here, make observations of how are our role models appearing in schools, right? What are adults modeling as gender identity in schools? Is it a toxic masculinity? Isn't it overburdening young women or teachers to be caretakers? And how do we move past those? And then some of the feelings that might come up. So toxicity, limiting, confusion, triggering, and having open conversations with our young people of like, what does it feel to go into a store and not find something that fits you in the way that you want to present? Or how did it feel to be misgendered in a class? Or even conversations of like, what is it like to have adults in your building who maybe identify as transgender, and having discussions about that and normalizing that we're part of a community and it has a diversity of people in it. Let's move to the next slide, Paul. So one way that we do that and encourage young folks really early on, but we as teachers, right, first teachers to students, starts at home. And so is to understand the difference. So in my experience as an administrator in many schools, so not just the one I had the role in, when gender becomes an issue, the young girl playing soccer, the young boy wearing a color that might not look traditionally male, a pink, or the young boy who likes to be part of choir versus an athletic sport. The reaction that society, it's perpetuated in society, like the anger or the questioning or the confusion, is not actually about gender. It's homophobia. It's an attachment of gender to sexual orientation that many times is not even at play. If we're talking about young kids under middle school age, they're not thinking about, they have no romantic feelings yet, right? It's not a piece of their development yet that they've gotten to. And so adults are perpetuating the violence of homophobia in making sure that they're naming the gender as something that a little boy or a little girl, right, in quotes, shouldn't be doing. So they're assigning a gendered norm to a conceived gender identity because the child hasn't stated it yet, and then attaching it to a gender expression that they're saying, this doesn't fit in my box of understanding. So the first thing we need to do is to break down the boxes. Gender identity, if you see the top of the unicorn, this is how I love TSER does this, and we'll share the slides with everyone. But this is just an easy way to communicate to kids. We used to have the gender unicorn up in my classrooms. And that's what the rainbow on the top of the head is like, that's what I believe. This is what I think of myself, right? So my gender identity is transmasculine. And I say transmasculine, not male, for a reason. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a second. So you see on the right and the furthest right, some classifications. So female, woman, girl, man, male, man, boy, other genders as they exist. And there's many, and we'll share a little bit more about what that looks like as well. Gender expression, this is what my appearance is, right? How I walk into the world. And so I might have a gender identity that does not necessarily, for everyone else, match the way that I express it. So I might be transmasculine and present as somebody who is very feminine. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just is what it is. Similarly, you might have someone who identifies as female and prefers to dress in masculine clothing. And so the expression is how I am expressing my gender. It can change from day to day, from minute to minute. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the pronouns that I chose to share with you today, as an example. Sex assigned at birth, those are the chromosomes, and you see them at the bottom part of where the anatomy of the unicorn would be if they had one. And so that's the sex assigned at birth. So your chromosomes, your biology, as the medical complex has stated, are female, male, or intersex or other. And so the chromosome signifies that on the unicorn. And then your heart is where you're attracted to, right? So physically attracted, emotionally attracted, and this can oftentimes be called your sexual orientation. And I would say in between sex assigned at birth and the bottom two levels, that's where you can separate the two, right? Your gender identity has nothing to do with your sexual orientation. Oftentimes the two are confused, and there's a relationship created between the two, and it really, there is no relationship. I could identify as a male person, be in a relationship with another male person, and not identify as gay. So our understanding of gender and sexual orientation is very limited, and it's much more complex than I think most people have a language for. In an area like the Bay, the language is very expansive. So what do? How do we create some language so we know how to talk to one another and how to relate to people who identify outside of binary constructs? And the binary constructs here are male, female, and in sexual orientation, straight, not straight, right? There's a bunch of in between in both of those constructs. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Fong. So if we were to take our memories of when we became aware of gender identity and fast forward to today, where along the spectrum would you place your gender expression? Marcello's I don't know if you're a computer, they're at a computer yet, so maybe they can't, but maybe I'll help you, Marcello, or Fang will help. Marcello, you had said you'd help me. So you said your gender identity is they. If this is a line and in the left side, Fang is showing me all the way to the left is very, 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 very masculine. Like what you would see in a comic book as like a superhero Black Panther kind of animation. And then feminine is what we would normally see in books, like a princess or a queen. And then in the middle is in the middle, not any one of those, not very masculine, not very feminine. If that was your fist, where would you want me to put it along that line?
I want you to put it right in the middle of the middle one.
Right there?
Right there.
That's awesome. Can you share, Marcello, a little bit of why you want me to put it right there? I'm not sure that they might have connection issues. So Marcello asked that they be placed right in the middle. They use they, them pronouns. And that box says gender nonconforming, meaning they do not identify on either end of the binary. And obviously Marcello is a very amazing person who already has language like they, them that they're able to use, right? So it makes sense to me that that's where they placed their fist. Now, that's their gender expression. It's a dark car. That might not have been where I placed Marcello, if that makes sense to folks. They, them, to me, is their gender identity. They identify as not part of the binary. It could be that Marcello loves to wear extremely masculine clothing and present as masculine in everyday life. They might have then moved their fist all the way to the left. Does that make sense to folks? Yeah, I'm seeing head nods. Equally, dad's plaid is covering Marcello. Marcello might have a beautiful gown on right now and decide that they want to present as female. You know, they want to express themselves in a feminine way, and that's where they feel most comfortable, and still use they, them pronouns because they identify as non-binary. And so they would have moved the fist all the way to the right. All right, so here's the practice set for you because Marcello has now set the standard. So now you all have to, as adults, meet the
Can I
bar.
just ask a quick question?
Yes.
So in what you were just showing, so there is it sounds like there is where you could place this, but it also sounds like depending on time, you know, that's not necessarily something that's correct of all times, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Gender is not a stagnant thing. It changes with access to language, which is what we're building now. It changes with exposure to experiences that you might not have. Not to pinpoint you, but in Ecuador, I'll say a female identified person living in Ecuador might not even know what the word transgender is. So they might not have any option outside of the language they've been provided by really the medical complex of you're assigned feminine at birth or female at birth, and genetically, anatomically, we're telling you you fall in this category. And so now this is the language that we're giving you to describe your experience.
Yeah, but what I meant was outside of the kind of the evolution of something, is there just a temporary aspect of it that changes? Because I remember one of the talks I was at, I'm just blanking out on the name of this woman who wrote this amazing book, but she was describing her child as, you know, depending on the day, literally, he would feel one way or another. Sometimes, you know, and I honestly, I can't remember right now what pronouns he or she or they used, but
they might use all of them.
Yeah, but to me, what was interesting is that there was a kind of a really temporal aspect of it, that it's almost like on the day they, you know, would express it differently depending on how the person wakes up that day.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's why I was trying to figure, like, outside of just evolution, that over time we get maybe different ways of thinking about it. It seems like there's a temporal aspect to it as well.
Yeah, there could be a temporary aspect, and there's not always, right? There's some people who will always were given the language and assigned male at birth and never fluctuate from that space, either because of comfort or because that actually is how they identify and feel comfortable expressing themselves. And then there's many people where it's much more fluid. And what we want to build as a community is space for the fluidity, right? That at any one time, someone could ask of us to use a different set of pronouns, or for us to be accepting of a different way of expressing, and that we've worked hard enough on our internal school culture that they feel like they belong regardless. So let's practice, because I'd love to see here, just so that we could see how differently this is, Lama, for everyone. Fong dropped a link. If you can click on the link, I'm inviting you all to think about, like Lama said, in your evolution, where would you place yourself on the gender expression line?
Jay, can I ask a question while
Yeah.
while we're doing this? So I just while we're here, because this is something I grapple with a lot, and I really wanted to hear your opinion on it. But you know, it feels like in all of the efforts in trying to move, continually trying to move away from the binary, that the terminology we use around gender expression just seems to be really reinforcing of those binaries. And I really grapple with it, you know, because it feels like when we talk about, you know, gender expression being masculine and feminine, like we're reinforcing those associations that a skirt is feminine, that a dress, you know, and I just, I know I struggle with that, you know, and I'm not sure where we go from there, but I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts or what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it's the construct that we've been taught to unlearn. And so it's hard work. And I struggle with it too, right? Even as a trans masculine person, the amount of safety I feel in being perceived, like I said, gender and unfortunately sexual orientation sometimes get co-inhabited. People will perceive me as a gay man. Something about the way that I express my masculinity to them is not cisgendered and not straight. And so they can't name the cisgendered because I look male enough, right? I pass in the community of transgender folks. That's what would be stated, right? I can pass, I can enter a room and be assumed male. But in a male specific space, so a barber shop, places where there's like masculinity heightened to the next level, people will read me as gay. And I don't have to be wearing a skirt. But I think it's just the way that we have been taught to understand gender, which is why we're having conversations like this, because one way to undo that, Melina, is to normalize. Normalize and also be an accomplice to conversations of like, why are terms like the word, I don't want to say it because my child is here. Why are there terms that are used to put down femininity in masculine presenting people, right? Yeah. And normally that's where it happens because masculinity is like the pillar of colonialism, right? And so when there's a place to attack, it happens with men. It can happen with women, although it's less often, specifically in schools.
Yeah, I see that. Okay, thanks so much, Jay. I really appreciate that.
And I love this because you could see no one in this space, regardless of how we present, and you can all look at yourselves in the Zoom squares, people would see us externally if you brought in an observer and they would plot us along binaries. And yet no one here feels like their gender expression, if they were to choose, would feel most comfortable in a binary.
Yeah, but I guess that what's interesting about what Melina just said is that, I mean, a part of that binary is the stereotyping of what that binary should look like, which is very conflated with just the notion of binary.
It's what happened to you when you had the short hair and you could play soccer.
Yeah, totally.
Or what happens after puberty hits and young women begin to, or female-bodied people begin to develop and are no longer feeling comfortable playing sports, or that there's attention now that they are receiving that is new to them. And many young women, many female-identified people or female-bodied people struggle in that change in puberty, where they now feel like there's all this additional attention that they have to deal with. Let's move on to the next slide. So we're going to do the same thing, and just to make sure we have it in our minds. So now if you were to think about your gender identity, not your expression, so this is how you think about yourself, where would you plot yourself? So go ahead and take your fist and place yourself along the spectrum. So male at the furthest point of the left in the binary, female at the furthest part of the right part of the binary, and gender non-binary in the middle, meaning you actually don't identify as male or female. And so here you could see when we talk about not expression, but identity, meaning like how we actually think of ourselves, not how society reads us, not what we choose to present when we step out the foot of our houses, but how we actually think of ourselves, we see much more of a binary split, right? Many people identify more along femininity or female identity. And then there's one person that I would put myself in there too, around where that other male identified fist is, not extremely male, but close enough to the end of that binary, which is why in my body, I present the way that I do. Although there are many trans masculine people who express their gender very differently than I do. Any questions on the difference? Do we feel like we have an understanding of gender expression and gender identity in order to not conflate the two? Yeah.
You know, Jay, I was just thinking it's interesting because I identify more as bi-gender, and just like that was really hard to try to place myself somewhere here, you know, because it's not that I'm moving towards the non-binary, because that's not how I perceive it, you know, but it really more of like a combination of the two genders.
Which is why it's so personal.
Exactly.
Right? And actually, you give us a great pivot. So let's move on to, so why the hell are we stuck in this? Let's move on to the next slide. Fong. We can skip slide 9. Let's move on to 10. So why does this happen? So when we think of anti-racist, we think of race, but anti-racist practice really to us in our body of work, Fong and I's, is about dominant culture. How has white supremacy, how has colonialism informed the way we think and act, right? And the institutions we think and act within. And school is one of them, the workplace is another, religious institutions is a third. And so anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably, right? Equitably, regardless of your expression, regardless of your identity. And Melina, you brought us to a great point. We're gonna share a video that really highlights how gender as a construct is really Western. It's really colonial in nature. It serves a European mindset. Nothing is black and white. Everything's black and white. There's rarely any gray. Puritan beliefs are brought off of it. And so, but there's a history of cultures across the globe that believe in so many more genders. Second, third, fourth, fifth. And a way to minimize the experience of indigenous culture, to violate indigeneity as a place of being for many people across the globe, this was created, right? This construct of either this or that, feminine or masculine. But many of us in the movement of like Two Spirits or Native communities, we understand that for many of us, the spirituality of gender looks more like this.
Okay, let me just make sure if it's a little too loud, I can adjust it.
everybody is so excited for this.
Thanks, Fawn. So we just like to position the RBO and Target in our discussions. So that is, and it's a YouTube link, it's going to be included in the deck. But Melina, that is one way where I think what you shared is expressed in the video, right? That there might be somewhere in your spiritual background, in your cultural or ancestral understanding of self, more connection to a two-spirit identity. And so I would say that maybe there's, a connection there that you haven't come to get a chance to really play with yet. But that two-spirit identity is something that for many of us is actually, it's really a place of self-understanding and a rooted feeling to our ancestors that most folks don't have any clue even existed. And even in our own countries, I'm from Ecuador, I know Karina's from Peru, both countries were in the YouTube video. The way that capitalism functions and colonialism has come to inform how we make money, who we do business with, what languages we choose to study, where English is a prominent language, I think, across the world now, right? To be able to be global citizens as they try to create that construct for those countries that are developing countries, that culture there has been much more informed. And so ties to those native understandings of identity or to spirituality have become fragmented and broken. And so there's less of a connection to that. So you see the same homophobia happen in spaces where you would think there'd be a deeper understanding of gender expression and gender identity. So the one way to pivot, to create that anti-racist pivot for our young people and within our communities, because the biggest thing that I would ask as a takeaway from this is to have a conversation with someone who maybe isn't like-minded, and just to create an understanding of, like, how do you think of your gender expression or gender identity? But also to be explicit when naming what's happening here between adults, with youth in the school system, when we're thinking of something like a dress code, right? When we're thinking of how we're either inviting or advancing different people of different genders to take part in a game or a sport, right? Or who is leading in a specific genderized role in the school. If we're being gender expansive, then one of the ways that we want to do that is to introduce either or thinking. Either or thinking is the dominant culture characteristic, the white supremacy play that happens in society, where we're taught that there's only one answer possible in most circumstances, that binary thinking. Things are rarely gray. And so as a teaching tool, this carries way beyond gender, right? Because what do we see in our professional world, or even in society in general, that there's only one way of thinking. If we think of the discussion around marriage equality, around reproductive rights, around Black Lives Matter, around just about any societal ill, either or thinking is one of the white supremacy power plays that is happening in that, to separate and create individualized ways of believing that something's supposed to be a certain way. And so this is another way to add language to somebody's experience when they're saying, oh, that can't be, a young boy can't be dressed in a pink skirt, right? Unless it's Halloween or it's some sort of role playing. It's like, no, actually, you're stuck in either or thinking, right? You're acting in the way that dominant culture is wanting you to act. You're believing that it's only Black or white, that there's no middle ground. And that's how we begin our journey to allyship, to create understanding for things that don't fall neatly in boxes. So I've done a lot of talking. I want to get us back into small groups. We're going to go into a breakout room for 10 minutes, and we'll come back and debrief together before we close. And what I'd love for you all to do is to think about, how does a gender binary serve dominant culture in your school or in your home? And then how does it perpetuate violence for folks that don't fall into those norms? And if you're feeling really courageous, you might want to think about how have you perpetuated violence, either in the school setting, among peer groups, in your own social circles, wherever you feel the easiest entry point is to get that to that place of reflection. Cool. So we'll go to breakout rooms. We have 2 prompts. I think at this point we'll have 2 groups of 4. And Fang, I'd love for you to join since this is your community, and I could stay behind in the Zoom space if anybody needs support.
Jay, how about you answer some questions? Give me about 2 minutes so I can give you
Totally.
and do all those things.
Are there any questions before we go in?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Jay, can I email you?
Totally.
Okay, thank you. I just feel like I want to continue the conversation. I have a lot to ask. and talk
Yeah.
about. Okay, thanks so much.
Okay. Oh, I see it now. Sorry. I was wondering what the question was. My brain isn't functional today. So.
All right. Similarly to Jay, I don't usually do the back end stuff, so it's taking me a little bit longer. All right, I'm going to open up the rooms. I'll broadcast the questions for you all again. And if you need any support and you don't see it, just flag us and we'll jump on in. Here we go. See you all in a little bit.
Hey, Fawn, why don't you join room 1?
So give me one. Actually, I wanted to have them be together because Martha is, well, let me just. Welcome back, everyone.
Hola, Marta, ¿cómo está?
Bien, bien, gracias. Ya
Bien.
llegué a casa, ya estoy con cámara.
Bienvenida. So I'd love to hear, what happened, and there's always so much action in the breakout rooms. What happened? I'd love to hear from folks we haven't heard about. Maybe Marta, Stefano, Valentina, we haven't heard much from you in the last couple of minutes. What happened? How are dominant culture norms informing you at school or in work or at home? And then how are they perpetuating violence?
Well, am I muted? No.
No.
One of the conversations I just had is like, you know, as Latinos, Latina, we have our culture is very ingrained, like you were explaining, and I related so much of what you were talking earlier, you know, how they define the sex, how masculine takes over feminine, that has more power, not power, but they always put it like the masculine, in a way, like growing up as a boy or girl, you know, they show the boys like they have to be strong, not to be cry because it's a boy, and they have to be not to show those emotions. That is not good because they show the weakness. And for the woman, it's okay to be weak, or if they show emotion, it's fine because it's a woman. And those are the things that I think in this culture is it's very strong, that we have with my children, I have learned, and I have teach around me also, like, you know, I have a boy and a girl. I have both sexes. So my boy is pretty sensitive. So, you know, and sometimes he cries for certain things. And I mean, same thing, because he's a boy, he's like, they have come those arguments like, why are you crying? You're a boy, you're not supposed to show those emotions. And then I come and say, why not? That doesn't make him any less or any more than because he's a boy. I mean, they could show any emotion they could feel, like a woman. There's nothing wrong with it. That's just being human, you know, having feelings, having your emotions. So those
I love that Martha's also demonstrating a way of like being an accomplice, right? Intervening in that moment and saying, and why not? Humans have feelings. Yeah. Something happened, it triggered an emotion, and now this person, regardless of gender, is crying.
Exactly. Exactly. It shouldn't not matter what sex you are. I mean, you know, to show those emotions.
Thank you, Martha.
Awesome.
And I'll say, and I'm not sure, I'm not Italian. I have very close ties to Italian community, but that it's a cultural narrative that is intergenerational, right? So if you're not addressing it now, those messages get sent for the next generation and the next generation. And even if you're doing that work now, the exposure to culture around you will continue to have that need of that conversation from generation to generation to generation. It's never work that's done or completed. What about you, Stefano or Valentina?
So we were talking about, I mean, actually, Stefan had a very good observation about, I mean, like dividing into like two main groups, and that makes it two really also large groups. I mean, this concept of the binary, and we were thinking also about easy it is to manipulate, people when you just have these two groups, these two choices, is the black and the white. I mean, and point at the other group and make them less or the enemy, or this has been used in many different ways, or the ones that shouldn't be here, or the ones we're gonna kill, and so this whole idea of, like, I think you did mention, Jay, earlier about the gray versus the black. I mean, it should all be shades of gray, and it's actually oftentimes society tries to make it black and white. And so, yeah, that we had gone down that path. But Stefano, you add on to what we were saying.
Yeah, and also like what's interesting, because like you just talk about Italian people and how the Italian culture is like very into the binary system, and how it's difficult to change this, and like before the breakout room like finished, we were start to thinking about like what we can do to stop this, like what we can really do to stop keep talking about the binary system, about talking about only between two dichotomies, because like the word is like not only gray or black or white, but it's like gray. So.
And I mean, I come from a specific part of Italy that's very progressive, but I actually felt it a lot more here, the black and white, than I did back home. The bipartisan, the two parties, the two, I mean, like where I'm from Bologna, like everything was a shade of gray there, but I recognize it's not your standard Italy. And many different perspectives and points of view, and it didn't, I mean, I don't know, as an immigrant to this country, I actually felt a lot more put in boxes when I came here.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm familiar with parts of, well, both in London and Italy, that even the way that people are funneled into professional careers is gendered, where you have cosmetology and things that are more assimilated to folks that are of a female gender or a female identity. They're kind of pathwayed to those careers. And I know many female identified folks in Italy who have studied that way, and had to, when they've left and migrated, it was in a search to be able to actually study without having that responsibility of going into a field that was assumed to be for them. So it plays out in so many different ways, not just the way that we're able to express or identify, but even the opportunities that we have as far as professional careers later on in life. And I don't think that that's specific to just those countries. We're at 6:26. My lovely Zoom host is letting me know that we're almost at time. And I would not do right by you unless I gave you some specific action steps for you all to think about as we part ways here. So can we show slide 15? Great. And so the conversation obviously today was rich, and I thank you all for participating so authentically. Step one, I'd love for you all to, even if you have a sticky note, and we do this work every day, and I'm constantly unlearning things that white supremacy is in us, right? Colonialism is in us. It takes years to unpack, daily practice, to be mindful of how either or thinking is informing your expectations. So next time you have an expectation that isn't congruent to what the person is expressing or showing or identifying as, ask yourself, where is either or thinking? Where is colonialism and white supremacy informing my expectation at this moment? And that could look a bunch of ways, right? Like if you're asking people where their husband is or where they're married or when they're having kids or all of those questions that society burdens folks with, to think, where is this coming from? And give it a name. Because once you give it a name, you can tame it, right? You can say, oh, that's not me. That's what I've been taught to think. So let me shift away from that. So either our thinking, create a little thing on your desk, on your notebook, on your refrigerator, and next time something happens, think of it through that lens. And then the second one is consider how homophobia is playing into these dynamics. Homophobia, even if you don't think you are homophobic, I can tell you as someone who is queer identified, who is in a transmasculine body, I struggle with my own internalized homophobia in many ways. And it comes largely from what Martha shared. I'm Latino. I grew up with messages around what masculinity was, even before I identified as male myself. And so there are things in my mind that are recorded messages of what someone who is gay, faggot, pato, all of those derogatory terms that are still ingrained in me. So it's constant having to like, why is this? Where is it coming from? 9 times out of 10, it's homophobia that's at play. The third one is pay attention to who is being isolated and how that impacts connection. You're all here as part of a community that wants to transform an experience for young people. And so just know that it all has to be questioned. So pay attention, who's being left out of the conversation? If it's a rule, who is the rule not serving, right? If it's an event, who is the event not reaching? What voice is being left out of the conversation? And with that, I'd love for all of us to, we have one last slide and we're almost a minute out, so Fong can't cut me off. Show slide 16, Fong. She's a time sticker if you don't know. All right, so you get to choose one because I don't have too much time. Something you're leaving with, something in your head, a feeling that you're leaving with, something in your heart, or an action you're going to take, so something in your feet. An idea, something in your head, a feeling, something in your heart, an action, something in your feet. And I want you to go ahead and type it into the chat. So it would look like this. So I am leaving with a feeling, and it's that grateful to you all. I know one more school that's a safe space for young folks. Fong is feeling gratitude. Valentina is feeling connection. Who else? A feeling.
So we got Martha's feeling grateful. Lama, action, should learn more. Marcello is being mindful of either or thinking.
Awesome. Thank you, Fong. I appreciate you all. It is 6:31. I met my time break. I hope to see you again. Keep doing the good work of transforming schools. And remember, it's often gray.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And sorry for being a bit late.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Ciao a tutti.
Bye.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.